Welcome to the Coparenting Conversations podcast, brought to you by the Center for Divorce Education. With renowned psychologist Dr. Donald Gordon, we will delve into the complex world of co-parenting during and after divorce and separation. Join us as we explore some of the emotional, legal, and practical aspects of parental breakups, helping you navigate this transformative journey with wisdom and guidance. Whether you're currently going through a divorce, contemplating separation, or supporting a loved one in their journey, the Center for Divorce Education is here to empower you with knowledge and offer you a roadmap towards a brighter future. The information presented in this podcast is intended for educational purposes only. The presentation of this material is not intended to constitute mental health therapy or to diagnose mental health disorders. The presentation of this material is not intended to constitute legal advice. Participants are encouraged to discuss specific legal questions with a licensed attorney of their choice.
Welcome back to the Co-Parenting Conversations podcast with the Center for Divorce Education. I'm your host, Mike Eubanks, Operations Manager here at CDE. Today, we're joined by Dr. Don Gordon, Executive Director of CDE, and our guest, Krista Nash, a best interests attorney who works on behalf of children in high-conflict custody cases. Krista is known for helping families stay out of court by guiding them toward reason, collaboration, and a focus on what's best for the kids. She's the host of the Children First Family Law podcast, where she sheds light on how damaging litigation can be for families and what we can do instead to promote healthier co-parenting. Today's conversation will explore what it means to be a best interest attorney, how to reduce harm to children of divorce, and how the legal system can do better. So, welcome everyone. Don, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Well, thanks very much, Krista, for being with us. We're really going to benefit from your insights and experience. I'd like to start off by asking you to explain what a best interest attorney is and how your role is different from a traditional family law attorney representing a parent.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, I'd be happy to jump in right into that explanation. So depending what state you're in the United States, best interest attorneys are either existent or non-existent. Not every state has them in our domestic relations or divorce cases. And they're called different things. So I would just give everyone that caveat. Like some are called minors counsel. Some are called attorney for youth. There's a variety of different language that we use in different states. I practice largely in Colorado, where we call this role children's legal representatives. Some states will call them guardians ad litem. So since we're talking about divorce, this is the domestic relations space in Colorado, children's legal representative. And generally, best interest means this. It means that in almost every state, we have a variety of factors. I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast before. All those factors together get considered by the court in a child's best interest. And it's this sort of nebulous, we're trying to always nail it down as much as possible, but it's different in every case. And it's a variety of factors where we try to figure out what is the best thing for these children in this situation. And so the best interest attorney comes in either at the request of parents or by the court directly, sua sponte, meaning on the court's own motion, to try to bring some resolution and help the children, help the court really, and the parents understand from a child-focused party to the case to try to see whether we think A should happen or B should happen. What should the parenting time look like? What school should children go to? If there's medical conflicts, what should we do about those things? And the idea is that the best interest attorney is a little bit different than the voice of the child attorney, which we can get into if you'd like. There's some states that really the attorney has to go in and represent what the child wants, not what the attorney thinks that is in the best interest of the children. So that's the kind of rudimentary high level of what a best interest attorney is. And you are practicing as an attorney for the child in court, and you're in most states, you're under the same rules of evidence as other attorneys. It's a role pretty distinct from, for example, child custody evaluator, which a lot of states also have.
So what are the kinds of cases where a court will appoint a best interest attorney or a guardian ad litem? What makes a court do that? They don't do it in all cases, obviously.
They don't. As I've done my podcast, I've been encouraged by some states really having a broader application of this for children. And I certainly could get behind the idea that we would be doing better by children. I mean, one, we do better by children, which I know, Dawn, you're passionate about, if parents would get along and not try to sort of burn the relationship down on the way out the door. If they would be better co-parents, then you wouldn't need as many of me doing this work. But for those cases that are more adversarial, I wish every child had somebody like me to represent their interests, because children's voices often get highly discounted and really not even considered in many, many cases, which is unfortunate. I think that comes from a old perspective in previous decades that children were what we called chattel. You know, if you think about old England, like they were property, right? And so we didn't really care what they thought. We didn't really care. We really weren't looking at it in that kind of nuanced way. So the cases, I mean, there's not, when you look at states, there's a few states that literally do these appointments for almost every child. But in most states, there aren't very many attorneys like me who are actually committed to doing this work. And so there's a sort of supply and demand problem where there are a lot of cases that could benefit from this work, but there are only so many to go around. And so the court usually appoints me or someone like me on cases that are very highly entrenched. So cases that have gone on for a long time with many, many pleadings on the docket, you know, hundreds of things going back and forth that might have been going on for years, or a case that appears to be very high conflict from the get-go. I think courts look at it sort of like an ER with triage, like this one is bleeding significantly. And so it would really help the judge, especially, to have active eyes and ears, as opposed to just, there's a lot more people that do child custody evaluations who are able to come in and give a report, but they take a really long time generally. And they are dropping a report on people's laps and then leaving, versus a best interest attorney who is sticking around and helping actually actively advocate in a whole bunch, in every role that any other attorney can advocate in a case. So it can be very highly problem solving. It's kind of like keeping that doctor with you in the ER or the nurse with you all the time, instead of just letting the people leave and it keeps bleeding.
So who usually pays your fees?
In Colorado, we have state we have state pay that can come through the same office that pays the welfare systems attorneys, but people have to meet a level of indigency for that to be accepted by the court. So if it's not an indigent case, which most are not, then it is paid by the parents. And that can cause all sorts of headaches, especially for me, because I have to be pretty strict about whether they're paying and when they're paying and those sorts of things. And we have to sometimes go back to court and say, this person is, you know, now frustrated with me. You know, usually in the beginning, everyone's all happy and fine with paying. And then somebody is getting frustrated about, you know, my perception of what's happening in the case. And so then they want to try to ice me out by not paying me. So that can be a problem. The court is usually very committed, though. They're like, we appointed this person. Even if you asked for it, parent, the court has issued an order to appoint the best interest attorney. And therefore, the expectation is you're going to find a way to pay for it. I am trying to get better about coming off cases when I feel like my role is no longer very productive, because sometimes, particularly in parent-child contact problem cases, where one parent is really not seeing the other child and we're doing a lot of therapeutic work. Sometimes if I've been on the case for a very long time, I think it's time to move on to somebody else. Like my efficacy as an attorney is not, I think, warranted anymore. But I can do things like file motions. I can file motions to restrict parents, you know, to limit parenting time, to change parenting time. So it's a very active role. I do a lot of mediation with people, a lot of negotiation. And most of the time I've been describing it as a pretty adversarial role. It really isn't, unless it needs to be. The best thing about a best interest attorney, I think, if the attorney is doing it well, is that you are a really helpful, not entrenched person who can come in and provide this view that really can bring people together. And that is the most powerful thing, because many times parents will say, oh, I'm so grateful to have a problem solver who isn't fighting with everyone and who is trying to bring us together and help us find solutions, because we're all exhausted by the war that we found ourselves in. And if you talk to parents, they realize and will admit, like, this is bad for me. It's bad for my new family. It's bad for my children. How do we get out of this trench that we're in?
Yeah, that's got to feel very good when you're able to do that. Now, you mentioned that you're often able to help families avoid going to court. So what strategies do you use to de-escalate the conflict and guide parents toward more child-focused resolutions?
Well, first of all, I think that the most important skills that I bring are really that of just being an empathetic parent myself, and somebody who can earn credibility to be able, or relational credibility with everyone in the case, the attorneys, if there are attorneys, the parents, the children, so that I have this sort of relational dynamic that allows me to have the right to speak truth into their family, as opposed to being somebody who is considered oppositional or somebody who only pops in for a very brief period of time. So the solutions I bring are curated relationally in a way that is more personal, honestly, because I'm able to go to their homes. I always go to the homes. I think that people that are doing this work who refuse to do visits personally in homes are not doing their jobs well, because I can't even tell you how much you learn from being in a home and observing a child and talking to the child in his or her room, or having conversations at the kitchen table and seeing what they're living. You just get a much more thorough view of the whole entirety of that child's situation versus just doing things via Zoom. So I am able, because I'm in the homes and because I have these heartfelt conversations with people, I'm able to talk to them in a way that, and I'm not an expert on the case like a child custody evaluator would be. I can come in and say, what are the ways we can really try to solve this? Like, yes, you can run off to court, which is often what their attorneys are telling them is a solution. But there's something that resonates with a parent when I say, do you really think court is going to solve this? Because I can tell you it's not. Like, you look long term, and sorry about that. My entire podcast is really filled with people, researchers, and people who've done tons of work in their careers to show how damaging the conflict after divorce or through divorce and beyond is for children, and how that leads to, it's one of the adverse childhood experiences that we know is associated with terrible outcomes for children. And so when you talk to parents about it, they almost breathe a sigh of relief. They're like, yeah, I don't want to fight. I don't want to go to court. I just want this to end. And they're not generally hearing, often they're not hearing that from their attorneys. So for me to come in, they are usually relieved, and I'm able to de-escalate things. You asked me how. I do that by talking to them like I would, kind of a friend across a cup of coffee, and saying, is this really how you want this to look? Go to my podcast, listen to these researchers talk about how bad this is. Here's some great co-parenting solutions, like even your own entity that you all have, where there's education out there now. We know how many problems come from the fighting and the toxicity and the terrible co-parenting. And there fortunately are more and more solutions coming out there, and attorneys need to get better at learning about those so they can provide those to their clients and say, it doesn't have to be this way. Please go and avail yourselves of these resources so that it can be better. So I think it's just a rational problem solving, de-escalation, like that I hand them on a platter, and it makes sense to them. And so oftentimes it works. I'd say the vast majority of the cases that I come on, people are shocked at the ability that not just I have, but I working with all these other people, like the parents, the fact that we can take a case that has been a family, really, I hate to call it a case, a family that has been warring for a very long time, and actually produce solutions, is always shocking to attorneys and to even the parents themselves. And kids will just breathe a sigh of relief and just say, oh my gosh, all I want you to do is tell my parents to stop fighting. Can you help me with this? So it's really just sort of common sense. I don't have like particular tools other than treating people with compassion and trying to really listen and try to come up with creative solutions and to try to keep them out of court.
You said something interesting. You said you, in explaining to parents what the damage is to children, you'll send them to your podcasts, where you've had experts on there that talk about that in some detail. Is that correct? I hear you correctly about that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I actually pull it up on Spotify and look for my episode numbers, and I say, you need to go listen to this person and this person and this person who are talking about the effects of this toxic co-parenting from a psychological perspective. They have research on this. I send them to my podcast on incremental trust building and how important it is to start to understand how that trust got eroded and how to rebuild it with your co-parent, including little baby steps and just ways to do it better. I said, go listen to this one because this person has this amazing co-parenting class you can do, with coaches nationally, internationally, even though they're out of different states. Please go avail yourselves of these things so that you can do this right. And so I'm finding that it's a nice shortcut. It also saves people a lot of money because I can say, I don't need to tell you about this for the next hour. Like, go listen to the podcast episode, whatever, 10, 15, and 40 as a start. Or I'll give you another example. I did one with Dr. Marcia Klein-Pruitt, who I know has been involved in your work, on the importance of fathers. And so if I get mothers, for example, or fathers, but mothers especially, who are having trouble affirming the father in a child's life, I'll send them to that podcast. I'm like, go listen to this research on this podcast because it'll help you see what a leading psychologist has researched and found about the importance to your child of this person's role in your child's life. So you're not doing your child a favor in most cases, and we can talk about domestic violence, which is a different situation, but in most cases, you are actually hurting your child by trying to sort of smother that kid and not allow that child to have the relationship with the father, with, that child needs. And so that can be very, very helpful and persuasive. I also do things like send them. I've had on my show like Ellen Bruno, who did the Split films, and I send them that link and say, hey, I want you to go listen. I want you first, as we get started, to go listen to this podcast and go watch these films. And I send them links to watch those films at no cost so that they can come into the work with me, understanding the damage. And the Split films, for those who aren't aware, Ellen Bruno is an international filmmaker, and she did a documentary basically with only children's voices, pretty young children, maybe 6, 7, 8 years old. And then she did another one 10 years later with 11 of the 12 kids who were on the first show did the second one. So now they're 17, 18, 19 years old, and the impact of divorce. So when you make parents go watch that stuff, you hope that all these influences make them pause, make them choose attorneys who are less warring, and just make decisions that are, as peaceful as possible whenever they can.
Now you're giving parents, you're referring them to your podcast, which I think is brilliant because you don't have to sit there and spend hours explaining this stuff. It saves them money and you money, and it saves time. So, but my question is, how about compliance in general? How compliant are parents in following your homework assignment to go listen to podcasts?
I don't know. It's like anything else. I think most parents do some of it. It's not all of them, but I think most parents, yeah, I'd say maybe it's 70%, 75%, something like that. At least they know the resources are there. And honestly, some of the people I've had on my podcast, I mean, I have no financial incentive in what I'm doing, and there's no money exchange or anything like that, but I'm getting great resources for people. So, for example, I just wrote a stipulation, and, this kid is really struggling, acting one way in one home and completely different and like tyrannical in the other home. And the parents have got to get on the same page. It's an actually really terrible situation. We've had mental health situations, we've had suicidal ideation, and one parent just isn't seeing it at all. And the other parent is just getting barraged. And fortunately, by doing home visits, I was able to see this child in both homes and see how with my own eyes, the extreme difference in the presentation in the two homes. And so the attorney for one of the parents just wants to run off to court and take the kid away from the other parent. And, flip the script on the parenting time and all the school and on everything. And I'm like, everyone needs to slow their roll. What we actually need is more high level care for this child with this specific, one of these specific people. And we need good co-parenting because these two are not even sharing with each other. Like the very, very dangerous things that the kid is saying at one home, they're so weaponized against each other that they aren't, I'm having to share these audio recordings of the child saying these horrific things in one home about what that kid might do to another parent. And the other parent hasn't even been told, right? It's like, how am I supposed to help this situation if you don't let me into the conversation? And so I'm able to take some of those people then as the child legal representative, the best interest attorney, I can go find those solutions and write them into the stipulations and say, I need you to go take this class. Like, quit playing these attorneys all this money. I want you to go spend this amount of money and take this class. That'll be 9 weeks of co-parent work that will really hopefully set us in a different trajectory that is long-term problem solving. Because the courts, while they do some of that, I mean, they have your class, for example, which is great. The classes that you all have gotten in across the United States are so much better than we used to have in terms of what, and I know you're trying to reach into children's education too, and helping them have coping mechanisms, which I highly commend you for and really hope parents take advantage of. But parents need more than that too. It's like a bare minimum what they're getting through the courts. A 4-hour course isn't going to be enough to transform most people's, especially the high toxic parents, into, they need more than that. They need like more group hands-on kind of coaching. So, I really think that parents who go take that seriously, the podcast gives them a lot of resources. I'm like, please just go listen, go check out these 5 different resources. These aren't the only ones available. Another example would be, I've got people talking about how to pick a therapist for your child in a high conflict divorce situation, because it's a very specific type of therapist you need. And people are constantly getting the wrong type. People that are really scared of court are not the best to help with this kind of thing, because even somebody like myself cannot get the children's voices in without objections to evidence problems and to hearsay and things like that in certain states, like the one I'm in. And so I need therapists. And so if you pick the wrong therapist, you are, even with somebody like myself, you are not going to be able to get in some of your child's statements. So, by explaining those things from a therapist who does, has a national view on this, that can really help parents pick, avoid some of the problems and pick the right people.
Yeah, I can see how having the right therapist makes a big difference. You mentioned you go into the homes. For much of my career, I did home-based family therapy, and for my own practice and for my graduate students learning, they would go into the homes of delinquents and do family therapy, and it really makes a world of difference compared to meeting parents in your office. And first of all, what you're observing is much more realistic because they're in their own homes and they're more likely to behave the way they normally do than in an office. And secondly, in their own home, they have some power, so they can offer you something to drink and tea, and but in your office they have no power, so they're going to be more relaxed, so to have some power in their home. But the home-based work that you do is so important, and it's very few attorneys go into the homes and have that experience.
I think it's like malpractice not to, honestly. I mean, you just learn so much. It is incomparable. There is no possible way that you can get that same feeling. Bill, I told you one of the big reasons that I'm successful at this is that I curate the ability to have the authority to give suggestions that are taken seriously, because I've created relationships and there's a trust that's built. And that comes so much from in-person work. And so I do Zoom meetings with parents, mostly for a cost basis, because I'm doing cases like all over the state. And if I have to do every meeting in person, it would just be so cost prohibitive. But I do Zoom meetings with the parents initially, but then I meet them almost always when I come do those visits with their children. So at least there's some personal touch going on there. I generally don't interview them again. I'm there really just to say hello and see their children and interview the children. But, I come in jeans. Sometimes I bring my little King Charles Cavalier Spaniel, my little therapy dog. And, the kids love that. If the parents are open to that, I'll bring him. And, I'll sit there on the floor with the kids, and there's just nothing like it. I mean, kids are going to cry with you. They're going to show you their stuff. They're going to show you their drawings. They'll point things out in their room. I can't even describe how important it is. It also, I get a very good sense of the layout. And sometimes in some of these cases, that's very critical. I was just in a really big case this past week, and my understanding of the physical layout of the home was very, very important because we had some child abuse like things going on, and where the child would be and where the parent would be and where the caretaker would be. These things were all very, very relevant. So it makes me far better if we do get to court at examining witnesses to be able to say, well, I know that this is how this is laid out. Isn't this true? So I know more than the other attorneys do then about what the actual facts are in a home, right? I've seen it with my own eyes, which is why the courts then find things so probative, because I've had those conversations. I've been in the homes. I've looked at the people in the eye and had heart to heart. So it's just a very impactful role, and it's very fulfilling, like you said, because you're really, in almost all cases, you don't have to get in the fight. Like, you literally can just be the problem solver. I'll tell you, the time we get in the fight is usually when the attorney is so entrenched with a client that they won't let their client face reality. That's when we go to court.
When you're testifying in court, I mentioned you've run into the situation, as I have, where the attorney on one side is trying to discredit you. How often does that happen, and how do you handle that?
Well, that brings up a really important distinction to clarify. So if you're a child custody evaluator, like in Colorado, we call those child and family investigators or parental responsibilities evaluators. Those are called a variety of things across the country and the world, but they're mostly known as child custody evaluations, as a colloquial term. And I've done that in my work before, and I'm credentialed to do so. Then you are an expert who comes in and testifies. You write a report. That report gets admitted as evidence. And I do, by the way, have a podcast that explains in a lot more detail than I'm saying right now the difference between these types of roles. But when I'm serving as the best interest attorney, I'm not an expert and I'm not a witness, and I don't write reports. I'm actually barred from doing any of those things. So I am not subject to cross-examination. I'm not sitting on the stand giving testimony. I'm functioning just like another attorney in the courtroom, where they literally split the time in thirds, or I take a piece of it with the other attorneys or with the pro se parties. And I am bringing my own witnesses. So I'm direct examining, cross-examining. I mean, they still try to discredit me through their own witnesses and through joint trial management certificates and things like that they submit with the court. But the role is very different, which is why I have to adhere, unless you have a more creative and loose evidentiary rules. That's why I, as the child's best interest attorney, still have to adhere to the hearsay rules, which is why I mentioned that the therapist is so important, et cetera. So it's a very different role, and very important to understand that most times that best interest attorney is not testifying and is not writing a report, which makes it more powerful in terms of its ability to, I can call my own witnesses. And when a child advocate is bringing something to court and producing evidence and bringing witnesses, the court's going to pay attention, obviously, because you're not a parent in the case. And so there's more independence to it. So it carries likely more weight. But it is very, very different than the child custody evaluations. And the dilemma with the child custody evaluations is that you really can't be evaluative with parents. You're just taking information in when you go do these interviews, and you do the same kind of investigation. If you're doing a good job, you're interviewing teachers and therapists and going to homes and looking at records and talking to parents and children, but you're not able to sit down and curate a relationship with them. You're literally just taking all that information in, and then you're going back to your office and you're writing up a big report that makes recommendations. But you're not able to sit there and say during the interview, hey, have you thought about doing it this way or that way? And, maybe this would be better. And why don't we go just work with the other parent and try to come up with a solution? That's not your job. So that's why it's really more of an adversarial system to have a child custody evaluation versus the work I do. I'm trying to not be adversarial. I'm trying to be collaborative and try, I mean, not in terms of collaborative law, like we hear as a term of art, but I'm trying to be amicable.
Now, from your experience, what are some of the most serious psychological or emotional impacts on kids when parents stay locked in high conflict litigation for a long time?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, you could speak better than I could to that with your psychological background, but I would say that kids have long-term adverse. First of all, they don't believe in marriage generally. They have struggles with relationships in the future. They don't trust. They have trust issues. That's a huge one. Sometimes they have, I'm seeing much more like mental health challenges too, where we've got like a lot more anxiety, we have more depression, we have more suicidal ideation. I've been, amazed to see, I think in Colorado, I think perhaps the number one reason for fatalities of children in the like 10 or 10 to 12 maybe age range is suicide. And so, we have a lot of that. I get a lot of cases like that where the child is really, really struggling. And, we get cutting, we get behavioral problems in school, and real serious depression going on. And so that, I don't know it's going to be interesting to see longitudinal studies come forward on this, and how it really affects kids, because I think we're really just getting to that. But it's dramatic. And if anybody goes and looks at adverse childhood experiences, you can just Google it. You'll find things on like the Cornell Medical School website and things like that, that talk in great detail about how scary it is to have gone through these kinds of experiences. And one of the big ones is divorce, and it's not any divorce, it's high toxic divorce, high conflict divorce that spills over into the child's youth in every possible way. So we end up not just ending the family as they know it, but creating like a war zone that puts the child very much in the middle and creates a lot of loyalty bind problems and a lot of like deceit, a lot of hiding things from one parent or the other, a lot of very disturbing protective behavior or enmeshment, where kids are like regressing because they're just so like, they have to sleep with their parent all the time, or they, they just, they're struggling in school and things like that. So there's just so many things. And when you talk to parents about that, they're like, oh my gosh. I mean, if anybody hears about those things or watches the Split film, I can't imagine that you can't weep and say, oh my gosh, I don't want that for my child.
Yeah, I think it's pretty, as a parent and grandparent, it's pretty hard to watch them suffering, be made aware of what the negative effects are, and then not be touched by that.
A child's experience in a divorce where parents then hate each other and they can't be friends, can't at least be cordial, and like, can you not wish the best for this other person who you had a child with, right? Being in the midst of that taints every single thing about that child's experience, like every sporting event, either the parents are both there and everybody knows it's high conflict, or only one parent's there and the child knows that the other parent can't be there because it's too conflicted. It taints school stuff. It taints parent teacher conferences. It taints vacation planning. Every holiday, kids are yanked around house to house, being asked to take on the world. There's almost nothing in that child's life that isn't directly affected by high conflict divorce. And so you basically say, yeah, I'm going to get divorced because it'd be better for my kid if we weren't arguing in the home. Yeah, that's fine, as long as you can get along. Maybe that's true, but I don't think people think enough about the impact that their high conflict post-divorce or through the divorce and after the divorce, how that landscape is like pouring poison into their children, which is what it's doing, which is just really incredibly tragic. And it's not what any parent wants to do. They just find themselves in the middle of a war zone and they don't know how to get out of it. So that's part of my job.
How do you approach cases that involve claims of parental alienation, especially where emotions are high and the facts are difficult to pin down?
I've talked about this a lot of my podcasts with researchers, some of whom have gone far enough to, so far as to say alienation has become a term that is so misused to almost be almost useless, honestly. It's not that those characteristics don't occur. It's just that we've really weaponized that term. It's kind of like calling somebody a narcissist. Every family law attorney every single day gets calls with consult saying, I know you must hear this every day, but my husband is truly the definition of a narcissist. And so it starts to lose its impact. It is true that narcissism is a thing, but not everybody's a narcissist. And same thing with alienation. It's something that exists. It's to express to parents what that is. It is a intentional poisoning, really, of the child's relationship with the other parent. And there's a continuum of parent-child contact problems, PCCP, which is the sort of preferred way now people are talking about this problem. And what I do is explain to people, I get parents who, they get on their first interview with me and one of them's like, oh, he's a narcissist. And the other one's like, she's an alienator, or vice versa. And they'll start sending me articles and all sorts of things on all their different things they've found, both of them, to load my inbox up with research on narcissism or research on gaslighting or research on alienation. And I've done a lot of training on this as well. And I would just say that what I do is say, look, there's a rare case, rarely we have cases, but sometimes we do, where there truly are alienating behaviors going on that absolutely have to stop. For example, a case where somebody might be, putting flyers up about the other parent. That's a problem, right? Or, I had one time where somebody was like, bringing sex abuse claims to everyone in the school about the other parent, and it was untrue, right? So those would be some examples, right? Or making a kid be afraid of a parent that they shouldn't be afraid of, okay? Now, those are sort of alienating characteristics. What generally is happening, though, with parent-child contact problems is I try to explain to parents, especially the person who is not seeing their child as much, or the resisted parent, I will call that person. I try to explain that it's sort of like a big soup, right? It's almost impossible for us, I'd say basically impossible for us to pull out everything and know exactly what has impacted a kid in which way, right? It is lived experience with a parent. It is the child's personality and proclivities. It is the other parent's unwillingness to affirm. That's usually the way the factor is written in the best interest standard, a parent's ability to affirm the love and affection of the child to the other parent. And I oftentimes talk with that favored parent about their significant, some psychologists will call it linchpin, role in making this better by doing more, even if they don't think they're an alienator, okay, which maybe they aren't. They still likely are by a sigh or an eye roll or their tone of voice or their body language or the way they talk to their friends on the phone or the way that they cry and the kids see it or their own fear response about something that they believe the kid is maybe being exposed to, even if there isn't any evidence to that. They take their own experiences, they put their own goggles on, and they can't help but pour that into the kid. And so oftentimes we need a family system approach where oftentimes it's the mom, it's not always the mom, but that protective parent needs to understand what his or her role is in sending a message to the child that makes the child worse, potentially, in terms of ability to engage with the other parent. And then the other parent, the parent who is not preferred, needs to understand that it's very narrow. It's too narrow to think that this is all the other parent's fault. There might be pieces of it that the other parent could do better, but there are also a lot of things that resisted parent needs to understand that are based on lived experiences that the child has seen. So, for example, maybe the child has seen the parent yelling or been yelled at, to the child directly, or witnessed abuse themselves, or heard or seen the impacts of the way that a parent treated the other parent or treated the other siblings, or the way a parent showed up or didn't show up for a kid, right? Or just the natural affinity a kid might have for one parent. Maybe it was the way that the parents divided their roles when they were together as a family. Sometimes we get one parent who was the one that was this very common, who was far more engaged in the raising in connection with that child. And so when we get divorced, that child, it might not be alienation. It's just that the child really prefers the other parent, the parent that they've been raised by, basically. And we have to figure out how to not just throw that kid into a 50-50 parenting situation right off the bat when that parent hasn't really engaged with the child very well. So it's just very, very complicated. And so mostly I'm explaining to people, it's very complicated. This is a human. This is not, we can't assign 1% blame to this and 10% blame to this and not, and 89% to all of this. Like, that's just not how a human child works.
I had a question about that type of work that you do. You're seeing, like you said, a lot of times you're the only person in the room that's fully focused on the child's well-being. What kind of cases stay with you emotionally, and how do you manage the emotional demands of this work over time?
Don, that is such a good question. I think it's one I've never been asked. So I appreciate the question. I do talk with my psychologist colleagues about the need for self-care. I used to be a reporter, so I have a pretty thick skin. I have a pretty good ability to get on the scene and see something and be able to compartmentalize it. And I think that is part of what helps in my own life. People ask me all the time, how can you do this? There's all these sad stories. And I guess I feel a little bit like maybe an oncologist, a cancer doctor, where it's yes, I'm dealing with a lot of sad stuff, but there are optimistic pieces of it. And the definition of success might not be perfectly, intact relationships with both parents, with all the kids, but I know I've helped. And I know that the work I've done has impacted children, even if they end up still having a problem with a parent. My hope is that they're a healthier adult through some of the work that we've done. So I guess one way is knowing that success in my work is not always, a perfectly happy ending for everybody in terms of what parents might wish for the relationships with their kids. But yes, there are certainly cases that stick with me. And I think it's a variety of things. I mean, there's some kids that are just so incredibly engaging or surprising in particular ways. Like, I've had kids with special needs who actually surprised me in their intellect and the kind of amazing conversations that we had about, things in their room or books or just really incredible questions they would ask me. Kids stick with me who ask me probing questions about their own rights and why the system is the way it is and why they don't get more of a say. I mean, some states, if you go across the border to, down south and you head a little bit further south and go to Texas from Colorado, if you're 12 or over, the court they shall interview you. I almost never get judges who are willing to do that, and so the kids will be confused about that. And those are probing questions. The ones that stick with me the very most, though, are the ones where, even though it's a divorce case, where I find that there are shades of abuse going on of the child, that I have to come in and say that is not okay, and I have to really be kind of mama bear for that kid. Those stick with me, and also kids who are really sick and their parents cannot stop their warring, even though the child might be dying, for example, which I've had. And I think those are the ones that wake me up, in the middle of the night, thinking about those kids, because their pain I can see because they're so ill, their physical pain. And yet when you ask them what they want more than anything, they want their parents to please stop the fighting and to you want to just shake these parents and say, can you not see the pain that this child's in, not just from the illness, but from what you are doing, right? Those are the ones that I feel like I almost can't. I mean, I do them, but I mean, it's raw for me, and it's it might bring me to tears.
In cases like that, I'd be tempted to recommend the judge place the child in foster care.
I've had a couple where we've had that, where we've had to take a kid and move that kid to, not a sick kid, but a kid where it's really messed up. We've had to take a kid and send that kid to a boarding school kind of situation for higher level care, when you've got, sometimes the kid will be resisting one parent, but the other parent is really not functional or safe. Maybe not a child protective level, welfare state, unsafe, but clearly not safe for the child in a way that we have to go act and do something. So yeah, I mean, it's a complicated, I mean, I feel like it's a place of privilege, this job though. I mean, I can't imagine, like for me being an attorney, I love being in the seat because I get to come into this really broken spot. I mean, I represent parents too in cases, but I don't like it nearly as much because it's a completely different role, and I'm not on one side of the courtroom, arguing against another attorney and fighting over money and things like that. I'm just right heart smack in the middle with the children and trying to help them flourish and trying to help encourage parents that there is a better way to do this, and I'm hoping also through the podcast to encourage the bar, right? Like, you're a family law attorney, you're a first responder. This is not, I fight with people like, you shouldn't be doing depositions, and they'll fight me back because now they know that I'm like, got the family flag flying, right? I'm like pro family, you're a family. Even if you got divorced, you still have a family to protect. And I consider myself a family defense attorney, not a divorce attorney, even though I'm in divorce land. And I think more family law attorneys should view themselves that way, because if they did, they would be looking for human flourishing, not just padding their own pockets or making a lot of money in a trench with the other parent being, the enemy, honestly. And so when people will say to me, well, what do you mean you don't think depositions are okay in family law? We are under the civil rules. We can do depositions. It's not anti-family. I'm like, it is anti-family. It is. It's causing more stress. It's causing less trust building. It's eroding and degrading the ability for these parents to ever be functional co-parents. And you don't need to do it. There are other ways to get your information. You don't need to go sit dad down for a deposition, right? And so some attorneys just don't get that. They're like, oh yeah, I'm a civil litigator, I'm just going to go do depositions, no problem. And they don't work hard enough to stay out of court because they make a lot of money in court. And oftentimes that's just kind of how we're trained. It's like going to a surgeon. A surgeon's like, hey, yeah, you could take vitamins maybe, or go to a naturalist doctor, but maybe we should just do surgery. Let's just cut. That's kind of how family law attorneys are, most of them. And parents need to avoid those people because they, at least there are places where you do have to go to court. And so what you want in an attorney, I've got another podcast that's like the top 10 things to look for in an attorney. And this is one of them. It's really just like, if this person is not explaining to you that you should stay out of court at all costs, unless it's very, very last resort, then I would run from that attorney. If your attorney's not warning you in some of the ways I'm warning parents about the dangers of court and the dangers of the co-parenting relationship, to take certain actions like depositions. I say on my podcast, ask them, do you do depositions? And if they're like, yes, I do depositions, I'm great at them, I do them all the time, I just think it's a really important tool, then I'd be like, you're not getting hired, goodbye. Because that's not what you want. That's not what you want. Or anybody that has caution tape across their website, like, hire me, we're going to go to war for you. Don't hire those people.
Yeah. I understand that. Yeah, I stopped doing the type of cases stuck with me, and it caused me to stop doing it. I was doing expert witness testimony and evaluations in cases of allegations of child sexual abuse. And in several cases, it was clearly not happening, or false allegations.
Yeah.
One parent they were making it up in order to destroy the other parent. And it was really difficult to see that happen. And it's, and jury trials are tough. And one jury trial I testified, they sent the father to prison. He was a phenomenal father, but he went to prison because of the mom he convinced the jury that the child was being sexually abused by him, when actually it was her boyfriend that was sexually abusing the child.
I think so. Those are some of the hardest cases, because usually when a parent thinks that's happening, even if you've had tons of people in, from the state, different attorneys, different child advocates, and you've got a resounding number of people saying, we are not seeing it. There've been actual police forensic interviews, all those sorts of things, and they're still coming at this other parent. Those are really, really challenging, because by that time there usually is a very entrenched attorney representing that accusing parent. And I think it's like, that's a kind of case I actually don't think I can help very much on, because they just want to come after me, right? They think I'm going to come on. They often bring me on to say, we want to bring you on so you can, they're not saying this to me, but this is what the undertone is, because we want you to be now our 10th person that comes in, and we want you to talk to the kids and figure out this is all true. And I usually come in then and I'm like, this is not a good case, because I am not the police. I'm not going to come in and do forensic interviewing of your children. And this is not a do-over, and usually those cases are so entrenched that really they just need to go to court and the judge needs to figure it out. So I'm not all things to all people. Some of these I'm learning as I go are not the greatest match for a best interest attorney. And so I would not tell somebody to bring on a best interest attorney if that's what you're trying to do, because it can be very expensive. You're still paying attorney rates too. And, that best interest attorney is probably not going to give you a different answer than the first 10 people who came in. So that can be very, very hard.
Well, this is really helpful. Thank you very much today. Well, Mike, I appreciate the time that Krista spent with us and answering these questions and helping parents understand what a best interest attorney can do and the nuance of these cases.
Yes. So, Krista, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight with us today. Don, thank you for guiding a great conversation. And if you found today's episode helpful, please consider sharing it with someone who might benefit. If you're going through a separation or divorce, remember that the Center for Divorce Education is here to support you with practical, evidence-based tools for healthier co-parenting. So thanks again for joining us on Co-Parenting Conversations, and we'll see you next time.